Instead, I'll fill in a few blanks that are not in this little document. Randy and I met 38 years ago. We've known each other for most of our lives. Met him when he was a lab assistant over on the first floor of the botany building in a lab that I was a postdoc in at the time. So we got to know each other quite well. When we parted ways, I joined the faculty here, and Randy went off into the world to seek gainful employment. And what's not in this document is the fact that he worked for the Park Service for a brief period of time, something that he doesn't put on his CV because that job literally sucked, and he can tell you about that if he wants to. He contacted me and said, I got to get back to school. I got to get back into school right now. So he entered San Francisco State and did really well there, well enough that when he was only about halfway through his program, he applied for admission to our department, the doctoral program, got accepted and moved here and did his degrees simultaneously. So he finished his master's degree, was in a doctoral program in my lab, was on the way to getting a PhD, and then, again, he started doing something else in parallel, and that was to get into the Environmental Science and Engineering program and get a DE and V with Malcolm Gordon. And when he graduated, then he had his 2 doctoral degrees from UCLA, and that's why we always refer to him as the UCLA paradox. Now, after that, getting 2 degrees, he went off to his next position on the basis of his DE and V degree. And that was when he worked for the city of Los Angeles as a consultant, working on the Mono Lake problem. He was the resident expert from the biological point of view. After that job, he then got his permanent career job working for the Los Angeles Municipal Water District. That job was not a sit-behind-the-desk job. That was involved lots of things, and he kept me posted on this over the years. And today he's going to give you a summary of all of this involving Malibu Creek. That he's now retired, but not inactive.
Thank you, Don. You know, I guess I know I should fill in the blank on the state park job. He mentioned that it sucked and it was literal, so I know you're dying to know. And it was just a simple, a septic trunk or tank on a truck, a reverse pressure, and escaped me on a Sunday afternoon with a giant family having a picnic, and it sprayed the entire family with outhouse material. Anyway, I was early on in the water industry. They took it really, they were really nice about it, actually, all things considered. Let's see. Yeah, Malibu Creek, why is Malibu Creek so salty? The first part of this talk is actually the fact that it was kind of overlooked for a very long time, myself included. It turned out to be a fairly old problem, and in researching I found out, well, how old is the problem? Well, water being too salty to drink is a very old problem. It goes back, in fact, these 2 gentlemen here, I should advance the slide. Oh, by the way, this is a talk on this report. It's huge. I don't have time to go into all the methods or the data. It's all available. And you can contact me individually to get through. The district has a PDF file, and it's located in the directory, so you might need my help in finding it. So if you want your very own copy of this report, everything's in it. I can cover only actually a small fraction of the data in here today. This report is a composite of data from 8 different agencies, all compiled. You'll be seeing a lot of those data today. Al-Karajis, back in 2008, these gentlemen here from Germany were in the Middle East. Naji could read, discovered these manuscripts, which are really not known that well to Western science. And it has diagrams in it. This one I put up because I still can't figure out what it's for. I think it's for measuring water level in a diagonal davit, or a davit in a mine. Reading in his work, you find out he notices and discusses how he knows the Earth is a sphere. So that caught my attention. For a long time, it was thought it was 2 people, one a famous mathematician, Karajis, the other an expert on his on the Imbat al-Mia al-Kafia, the excavation of hidden waters. And the excavation, water coming from the ground, is a lot what this talk is about today. And the rediscovery of basically a lot of the things he already mentioned. 4 points on this talk. I'll talk about an accident of tectonics very quickly, why Malibu Creek is unique in the Santa Monica Mountains for a coastal stream, move to a salty creek with an old problem with new data, and then lead into the geology, the Monterey Formation in particular, and impacts on water quality. Talk a little bit about some of the other marine formations in the watershed, just very briefly. But then most importantly, in the biology department of life sciences, a geological footprint, I believe, on the aquatic species composition and abundance. Tracing mineral content from rock to water to the biota across 3 trophic levels is not easy. And so as we get further away from the rock, so to speak, somewhere in here at the end, I'll freely admit I'll speculate on 2 things really quick. But if you want to track it through the reports there. Okay, let's talk about tectonics. Excuse me a moment. Dr. Rappaport over in Earth Sciences has a very nice video showing these Channel Islands as part of the Santa Monica Mountains, and it rotated in from the south and hit the North American continent, and it raised those mountains. If you're on a boat, which I was recently, looking this way east, you'll see it all lines up rather nicely. And there's some marine terraces on the north part of the Channel Islands, which were there because they're on the wrong side, but they're on the right side, and they rotated in and lifted those mountains, the Santa Monica Mountains. This is the Malibu Creek watershed in yellow. First off, it's unique because it goes all the way through the ridge line of the Santa Monica Mountains, and it drains an upper watershed that's about 100 square miles. Relative to most of the other Santa Monica coastal streams, which are smaller, they dry sooner. There's a water supply in this one longer than most of the other all of the other creeks that I've seen in the Santa Monica Mountains. So it drains a larger watershed right off the bat. Subdrainage in it. There's the Monterey Formation in the northern tributaries. So you've got drainage off the western headwaters, and you'll see some geology there in just a moment. Off of this part, the eastern headwaters, and then the northern headwaters coming down from above, actually as far as the Chatsworth Formation. Down in the lower creek here, down the city of Malibu, it's a blend of those 3 different subwatersheds, each with their own unique geology and water quality. This was the graph that, for me at least, kind of started it all. And this was just, you have data, you look at it. What you're looking at here is a trace of the salt levels in Malibu. Yes, sir. Oh, I'm sorry, was there a question? No. These are the salt levels in Malibu Creek, and what jumped out immediately was the incredible amount of oscillation in it. And these lined up with seasons. These are mostly wet months, these are dry months. And so it's if you're not familiar with these kinds of data, the amount of variance is very unusual. The other thing is how salty it is. What you're looking here in pink is the brackish water definition of about 1,000 to 1,500 microsiemens per centimeter. That's an electrical conductivity measure. And brackish water from 1,000 to 1,500, depending on who you talk with, Malibu Creek is more than brackish all the time. Here's the drinking water standard for salt content down here. I mentioned I'll show you some. Let's see what we got here. Yeah. You saw those green tributaries coming in from the eastern slopes. This is Cold Creek, one of those tributaries. You can set your watch by it. In point of fact, if you could expand the scale, you'd see these same sorts of seasonal oscillations common to almost all Southern California streams. But Malibu Creek has this tremendous oscillation, and then you see even Cold Creek will dip during large rain events. This is the stream gauge here, so these are large rain events. These are large rain years here, causing dips here and here and here. Once during a rainstorm, we were measuring that the first flush, the salt levels actually went up in Malibu Creek. So we think that was a first rinse result. The real surprise is north of Malibu Creek, the northern tributaries. Salt levels are just never seen anything that high at the time, ranging through here. And then the variation annually, it's not as clean. The data aren't as clean. Gap in the data here, that's not real. All the programs suspended monitoring in the watershed to try to keep out or control the invasive New Zealand mud snail. That was across programs. New Zealand mussels arrive. And then, let's see. I mentioned it's an old problem with new data. Here are some new data. Here are some old data. Going down the district records, municipal public water agencies usually have libraries. They're great places to spend time, particularly the old records, because you find out why was it formed to begin with. Why was a water district a public agency that people had to vote and pay for it? Was there not enough water locally? That's usually the case in Southern California. When you bring in more water, the home building goes way up. This is from the Malibu Creek watershed. Going back in the files, it turned out it wasn't just the amount of water, it was the quality of the water. These, what you're looking at here, are time series data on well water. And looking back then, even before there's hardly anybody in the watershed, the salt levels were very high. And not just salt. Some of the wells had names like Old Stinky, so that tips you off it's probably hydrogen sulfide. So it's an old problem with new data, and when I say new data, I'm not kidding. At this point, Malibu Creek watershed must be one of the most intensively sampled watersheds in the state, if not the country, with at this time, 8 different programs up and running concurrently for a period of time. So, and this is a time series showing those same monitoring programs. The Water District had the longest running series, but mainly located down in the lower watershed. No data from the upper watershed areas. Gilda Bay came in with the stream team at about this point and started sampling areas where people had never sampled before, places where hardly anybody is living there. So they were using that as a benchmark of what it should be relative to the water quality in the lower watershed. And then you have these other programs coming in with the National Park Service. You can actually tell something about study design from this graph. These two, Gilda Bay and the Water District, both had rectilinear study design, same sites every month, regular basis. Park Service here said, you know, we'll put out these number of sites, but we'll only visit one like every other month. And by staggering them, you can get data out of that with a smaller number of stations. And you can see that. The problem with it, of course, is you don't have a complete time series. But it's a great way of getting spatial coverage with less resources. Okay, what I want to focus on are these new sites located up in the headwaters of these different drainages. And the first thing we did was, well, on sites where we collect the same, at the same spot that somebody else does, you look at your data to see if you get the same results. And we did. So these are sites, these are both, what you're looking at here are different sites throughout the watershed. Those are those oscillating salt data I showed you before from Malibu Creek. The same site here, it's a shorter time series, but the ranges are the same, the oscillations are the same. Good parity of data with 2 different programs. Well, the next thing that jumped out though, Cold Creek, again, relatively low salt levels, very typical of other Santa Monica Mountain coastal streams. But these are the ones that really jumped out. It's like, you know, what do you make of these data? It's like, first time I saw the data, I wasn't really sure what was going on, but moving to geology, and call out for Jan Dougal on this particular map, by the way. Yerkes Campbell and other people had more geology mapping of the area, and it became available. So why not take a look? So let's map and use the same color coding, this map onto these stations. And all of a sudden it's like, you know, thank you Al-Karajis. Cold Creek, totally different geology. Canal volcanics in red, there's a small amount of canal volcanics, but all the really high ones were up through this geological band called the Monterey Formation, also known locally as the Modelo Formation. The Monterey Formation spreads throughout the state, and just historically, some of those locations, the formations were called different things, the Puente Formation and whatnot. So there was a really nice geographic association between the water quality data and the geology. How far can we take that? One of the neat things is if you had to tell somebody where would you find good water in this watershed, in the red, the canal volcanics, in terms of salt. Okay. Some of these wells are still there. I was surprised how many. Each one of these green dots is an up and running water well. And if you have a water well connected to a public water supply, you have to have one of these nifty devices which keeps it from backflowing into your public water system. It's called a backflow device. And so they have to be tested annually. So if you look to see where are the existing wells lining up, people really like the canal volcanics. And bear in mind that something else that Al-Karajis said about looking at people around, that they typically put wells, they map the water themselves where it tastes good, and that usually lines up with different geological features. There's a couple up here that are right in the heart of the Monterey Formation, and even to this day I've not gone and knocked on their door to ask them if they're drinking it. I need to do that. So the Monterey Formation, what is this stuff? Gary Fields and GIS put this together, this map showing the topography. Again, the Malibu Creek cutting through the crest line of the Santa Monica Mountains and draining this area here. And for over 10 years, this restaurant's been right at the toe. I drove by it every day. Talk about irony. And just, you know, gee, I wonder why the water quality is so bad. I drive by the sign that says salt. The Monterey Formation is California's primary oil-bearing shale. It's called a black shale. And it varies, its organic compound, this is biogenic rock, varies by 5 to 30% by weight. So if you can imagine a rock that has a 30% total organic carbon compound and not be coal, not be a piece of coal, that's pretty impressive. There's offshore drilling. Basically any place you see drilling along our coast, it's tapping this formation. It's a diatomaceous sedimentary rock, diatoms, marine diatoms, on the sea bottom that got uplifted by tectonics. This is an oblique aerial view of the formation right in this area here, a little bit to the west, showing that as a biologist looking at this, you see, where's the ground cover? In other areas, there's more ground cover. The earth is salty. You salt the earth, it's hard to get things to grow there. And what can grow there usually grows in like monoculture. It's also prone to slides. And when it slides, it leaves behind this white diatomaceous earth and salty precipitate. And then finally, the hills are kind of rolling. They erode very easily. So if you're driving up north along the coast and you see these rolling foothills, they're normally Monterey Formation rock. This is one of the larger slides. This is what happens, and it slides, and this material here is a combination of diatomaceous earth and salt and a bunch of other elements, which we will look at. In comparison to other world shales, the Monterey Formation stands out for these particular elements. These are elements that all shales have these elements in them. Monterey Formation is enriched in particular with these elements. We're going to look at most of these elements on their impacts on water quality, looking first at the major ions. This is not table salt. Oops, sorry. This is from one of the tributaries, Chesbrough Creek. And here's sodium chloride and potassium. Potassium doesn't even rank on that one. But in any event, it's not table salt. In fact, the main anion is sulfate in very large amounts. The main cations, the positive ones, are calcium and magnesium. I put together this chart symmetrically because the question is major ions, are you missing any? If you're missing any, this graph should not be symmetrical on a time series graph. So if it is symmetrical, it means you probably got most of the major ions. You might be missing some smaller ones that run along in the margins. But one quick thing I want to point out, it looks like there's not much chloride in there. That's plenty of chloride, even a lot for a local creek. It's just dwarfed by the sulfate and bicarbonate. These are sulfate data now moving into water quality throughout that area I showed you, within the Monterey Formation, in Malibu Creek, other areas in Malibu Creek, and then other coastal streams, and it jumps right out. The sulfate levels they're not off the chart, but they're close. Higher than sea level, higher than seawater, higher than the state plan objective, higher than the EPA drinking water standard. Most of the other creeks will meet these standards, not Malibu Creek, up in the Monterey Formation for sulfate. These data here, this is Malibu Creek where it all comes together and blends, so this is a blend. The really nice creeks that come off those flanks away from the shale, east and west tributaries down here. Up here, within the Monterey Formation, you notice two things. One, there's a whole lot more sulfate relative to salt, and the relationship seems to break up in first inspection. But if you tease these data out by individual tributaries, and I moved to chloride now, but it's the same thing for sulfate, you find out that scatter in the data is not scatter, it's just different tributaries. It was just a coding issue. The neat thing about this is, the main difference is, relative to the lower watershed, is that these slopes vary just by their slope, except for this one. This one in the East Fork of Las Virgenes Creek actually changes direction and slope. Chloride levels go down as salt levels go up. And ask me in a year. Or unless we can attract some graduate students to work on it. Okay, that was a reminder just because that's something else you can find out in the document. If you're not familiar with this diagram, don't worry about the details. What you're looking at, though, most importantly, is these are over 1,000 other streams in the United States. You're looking at ionic composition in the United States on this, what's called a Piper diagram. And most of them are here. The black is the Monterey Formation tributaries in Malibu Creek. So it's not only different for the Santa Monica Mountains, it's different nationally, insofar as the database reflects is a random sample nationally of the nation's streams. We found out later it's not a random sample. It doesn't affect the result that Malibu Creek has a unique, virtually unique ionic composition, and those ions are at high levels, okay? With that, we move on to some of the metals. Metals and metalloids. What you're looking at here is rock, not water. We're back to rock, and we're looking at the metals. The lines there are from oil platforms up in Santa Barbara, excuse me. Local data are here in black. One site, different samples chosen across the face of this freshly exposed site on conspicuous visual differences, and that was it, just to find out what kind of variation can you find in the rock. And the main thing, this was a cross-check to see if our Monterey Formation rock is similar to that up north. It is and it isn't. For some things, it's very similar. For other things, some of these samples, like vanadium, was low on one of the samples. But it's a pretty fair match, especially if you showed other rock, other types of rock. Now you're looking at water quality data sampled right where it comes together in the lower watershed for volatile organic compounds, semi-volatile organic compounds, pesticides. Malibu Creek actually is a pretty clean creek with respect to these compounds. Non-detects over 18 months of surveying. With one detect there was bisthalate, which is a known laboratory plasticware artifact. Perhaps if you lowered the detection limits, you'd start to get hits on some of these things. I know people use pesticides in the watershed. Maybe it was missed simply because the detection levels were not high enough, or low enough actually. But the metals jump right out. And the metals, you'll see later in the fish that it's the same metals that you find in the rock in the same, close to the same relative amounts, and in the fish. We'll see those data in just a moment. But I'm going to move quickly to algal nutrients, phosphate and nitrogen, which has been a huge issue in the Malibu Creek watershed of the algae and the eutrophication issues there. So, sorry, wrong direction. First thing, this is a map from down in Newport Bay sent to me by Terry Reeder at the basin, at the regional board down there. It's a historical map of the Newport Bay area where they also have Monterey Formation, and this historical map shows phosphate mines. So if you never took another sample from the rock, you could safely bet that the rock's got enough phosphorus in it and phosphate to mine this stuff, used as plant fertilizer. So we're off to a rocky start. Sorry. Just halfway through the talk, I just will check to wake up there. Sorry. Okay, so this is an elemental analysis of the fresh rock again, showing you the different forms of nutrients found in the rock. All the phosphate, nitrate, total organic nitrogen, nitrate, and nitrite, total Kuykendall nitrogen, which is mainly the organic fraction, phosphorus, and iron. Don't forget that algae need iron. If you go out in the ocean, you sprinkle iron in the right location, you can trigger an algal bloom that you can see from space just with iron. So there's a lot of it in the rock. Now we're moving to the water quality data. There's also a lot of it in the water, and it reflects the geology pretty nicely. These are the Monterey Formation northern tributaries, all above the current regulatory objective of 0.1. That is a hard target. In this watershed, you're not going to meet it, or at least in this creek, you're not going to meet it. Other Santa Monica mountain streams kind of hover around the regulatory target, but most of them are, it's just, you almost don't need statistics with that kind of a spread in the data. There's one datum here that's way off the chart, up at 3.5. Looking at nitrogen, it's pretty much the same story. Where the creek all comes together, it's all blended. It's not meeting the regulatory objective. If you move in the northern tributaries, it's spiking above it all the time. Excuse me, Cold Creek, that nice green creek coming in off the side there, always has relatively low amounts of nitrogen. So it's a good match up here. If you measure total nitrogen in the rock, there's a nice line up here with what you actually find in the water. Work that we did not do, but was done by the landfill, by the county landfill. They actually put the rock into different containers and leached it over time with water to find out what the leachate rates were like. They're consistent with these data. In fact, actually, the fresh rock will leach faster. So if you have a slide in a rain event, it'll leach very quickly. Now we're going to move into the biota. I've talked about the impact of what's in the rock, what's found in the water that's traceable to the rock. Now let's move on to the life sciences. Diatoms, starting at the bottom of the food chain with plants, diatoms, single-cell plants. First off, on our species list, we found this one, Navicula halophylla, Latin, like salt, halophylla. 91 species identified by Marina Potapova in the National Lab. Interestingly enough, we did that sample, we sent it out to a contract lab, we sent it out to a subcontract lab. Their list was different from the national expert on the taxonomy. And that was a great amount of concern at first, but until we compared the list, it turned out that the contract lab, the first 17 species they measured were ones on the slide that you could see there were lots of them. They just didn't know the rare ones, whereas so the list for the two labs was the same. It's just that Marina Potapova is a better taxonomist and could identify another 60 species for us. So that was the good news, and that was done gratis, by the way. That was done free of charge by Marina, so need to owe them a drink there. 77, and this is when we found out that 77 of the species, 85%, have water preference data in the National Diatom Water Quality Preference Database. And this database is used for everything from forensics. You know, if someone's murder out there and you say, what are the diatoms on the body, you can identify where the diatom likes to live, things like that. So we use the database for something different here. And when you go looking, gosh, 2 species unknown to science. Now, I'm an ichthyologist. If I discovered a new fish species, I'd probably alert the press. If you were a diatom taxonomist, there's a lot of new ones out there, but usually the rare ones. She found one that's actually fairly common in the creek, and that is unusual. So, you know, the question is this one there because it's unique to that creek, adapted to the mineral waters? Speculation. Let's take a look at those water quality preference data. But before we leave this, have experienced taxonomists, if you can find any, double check your species identifications on any work that matters in a practical sense. It's a real shout out for having curated collections and taxonomists working on this stuff. This is a small peek at the national data set for water preference. This thing goes on from multiple columns all the way to about here, and it goes down to about, if there were a basement, well into the basement. It's a lot of data. I'll point out some of these headers here, like sulfate high levels, like what are the, and by the way, these headers got shifted a bit. I just discovered this last night actually. But in any event, if you want to know for this top one, acanthidium here, it would have a sulfate high of 0.58 by those data. That's what it likes in terms of its highest amount of sulfate. And it's not like someone's put it in higher sulfate and found that it killed it. It's just that those are the waters where it's found from. It's a preference. So here, now what you're looking at are 682 diatom species from the national database, plotted here for electrical conductance, how salty can they handle it, and how much sulfate can they handle. Those are the national data. Those are the ones from Malibu Creek. It's a real nice linear relationship. I could, if you give me the species list at this point, I could tell you that there's a linear relationship in sulfate and salt in the creek without a single water sample. It's a nice tight fit. And also there's a lot of outliers. This caused a problem at first. I almost hesitate to include this part. And before I get there, the same relationship found for the other ones in the national data set for the different major ions. There's a really nice relationship there. Now here is the problem. When you plot it this way, these are the same national data with and this from Malibu Creek with the data broken up by different sites. Remember what I said about Malibu Creek never being below 1500 on specific conductance? Well, here's 1500. Why aren't all these red dots to the right of the 1500? So in other words, if you gave me if I challenge and say, you give me the diatoms, I'll tell you what the salt levels are, and I was using these data, you'd be wrong. You'd say that Malibu Creek is probably between 500 and 1,000, when really it's between 1,500 and 2,500. So we contacted Marina and asked her if she had any ideas, and she said in less than 13 seconds, yeah, it's because when our data came in, the database at that time, the streams out in the national database, they didn't have any that were that salty for diatom samples. And so our data set, once it's added in the national database, will actually move these red dots over into this range to correct the national database for things that the maxima that are known for these particular diatoms. So again, it's an unusual creek. It just, let's see, did I want to include that? Oh, this is the same thing, just showing, this is the range of values at the diatom survey sites, showing where it should be on the graph. From that, we move into macroalgae, but before we do, one diatom species is worth a shout out. This is Malibu muck in the dead of summer. Gone out there with a DO meter, a dissolved oxygen meter, and actually with a funnel collected these bubbles and measured them. And depending on which seep you've got, it's either air and it goes up really quick, or it drops down to 0 and it's probably hydrogen sulfide. And it took a while to understand this, but what you're looking at is gas generation from both sides of the bottom of the creek, from the aerobic side and the anaerobic side. Why is it anaerobic? Pleurocyra levis, Malibu muck, it attaches by a mucus pad, and you get enough of this stuff there, it will seal the bottom. And what happens in an environment where an aquatic environment with plenty of sulfate and lots of organic carbon sealed off from the air, and you get sulfate reducing bacteria in there, and they, instead of putting out CO2, they put out hydrogen sulfide gas, H2S. So these are a real problem. And I don't want to leave you with the impression that all of this green here is Pleurocyra levis. It's a mix. At the time we did our sampling, it was primarily Pleurocyra levis. And getting in the scientific literature, you find out it favors high magnesium and chloride levels. And remember that magnesium and chloride were some of the most predominant anions in the creek. With that, we move to macroalgae. I think most people in the room know about eutrophication. You enrich with fertilizer, you get excessive algal growth, impacts on water quality, especially at night in Southern California, and impacts on other aquatic life, suffocation, and what have you. This Malibu Creek, this green across it is there every summer. You know what's kind of interesting, the green, it's if you get underneath it, the water in the dead of summer is actually a little bit cooler. That, because of all the air, it's almost like a pool cover. And I throw that out there because people look at this as being a really bad thing, and for aesthetics and other reasons, like at night it eats up all the oxygen. But these are where all the fish are hanging out also underneath that canopy. Anyway, that's when I came across a study, though, about that time by Barry Biggs in New Zealand, where they had the same problem with the same algae, and it looks the same. He studied it, and he reports in his document, which is it's a really good report, should be read by all U.S. scientists, that 5 times he warns that downstream of marine tertiary siltstones, shales, if you have seeps, you'll find this algae taking over. Again, it has a large amount of fertilizer in the rock itself. And you know, people, when they made the regulations, they weren't aware of this work, and so it takes some time for science to. It can take some time for science to penetrate into a regulatory body. I pulled out one of the quotes here. He says the most common Cladophora tends to require warm waters, 15 degrees C, just right, Malibu Creek in the right time. It gets higher, of course, but. Found in North Island stream streaming limestone and marine tertiary siltstone, mudstone catchments. You know, if you took out New Zealand, the word New Zealand, you put in Malibu Creek, it would read identically in terms of the factual lining up of that. And something I just found out recently, though, up until, gosh, it was just a couple of weeks ago, in fact, this is from Malibu Creek showing it. I thought, well, you know, it's warm enough. It's got plenty of nutrients in there. So, of course, you're going to have a macrophyte is going to take advantage of that. Why wouldn't it? But it's more than that. What makes Malibu Creek unique is that it's also very salty. And that's going to exclude any macrophyte other than Cladophora that can't handle the high salt levels. And so this thing is Malibu Creek is basically tailor-made for Cladophora and Rhizoclonium. Just recently I found out there may be a subspecies of Cladophora that can actually handle lower levels of nutrients. In fact, levels that are found in some of the other Santa Monica mountain creeks. And then to top it off, in the Ventura River, this algae has been found with epiphytes, other plants growing on it, that can fix nitrogen out of the air. So there's going to be abundant nutrients in the creek for this particular species. And this particular species is going to be a lot of it because the other species, they can't make it. And that goes a little bit into speculation on that side. I haven't done any exclusion to find out if you took this algae out in the creek, just cleared it on a regular basis, could you get some of their algae to grow there? That's something that actually could be done if there are some graduate students in the room. Sorry. With that, we're going to move up the food chain to macroinvertebrates. Right off the bat, salinity greater than 1500 is known to impact macroinvertebrates. Well, that's the lowest level it gets in Malibu Creek. And in the upper watershed, it gets much higher. You know there's going to be an impact. An IBI score is just a score for rating these communities called the Index of Biological Integrity. And it's poor in Malibu Creek in comparison to other coastal streams, particularly poor in the Monterey Formation, with one anomaly. There's actually one site right in the middle of the purple, which has I think a fair or good IBI score. Never could figure that one out. That's, you know, those outstanding anomalies are where the fun usually begins. I'm going to leave that real quick until we get to metals, actually. With that, we go up to vertebrates. We're just about done here. Unfortunately, there's not much to work with. There's only 2 native species in the creek currently, up in the creek proper. The arroyo chub, Gila orcudi, and the southern steelhead trout, which is now endangered on the endangered species list. Turns out they're both adapted to high mineral levels. The anadromous trout can handle seawater. It's anadromous. And moving way over to speculation, I would say, you know, did the steelhead trout that can handle these going from fresh to salt water evolve elsewhere and move into the creek because it's a nice place to be? Or did it evolve in the creek and move elsewhere? Just an idle thought there. The tui chub, the thing that caught my attention, in the Mojave River, which is no slouch with respect to its mineral quality, there's a chub, there's a tui, the Mojave tui chub, and it's adapted to high mineral waters. The Malibu Creek chub, chub outcompetes it on its home turf, where it's invasive in that watershed. So hopefully it's no surprise now to know why you find these 2 particular fish species in Malibu Creek, and they can handle high mineral waters. It might also explain why you don't find some other species in Malibu Creek that might otherwise be there, like sticklebacks, for example. By the way, I want to do a call out real quickly here. About halfway through the research, so in terms of time, all the trout started to die. There was a massive die-off. And before they died, and when I say massive die-off, 4 different year classes in 9 months, all of them gone, right across year classes. And most of them, before they died, for those that were seen, turned over to this pale yellow morph here. So I wanted to include this in a talk to biologists, because if you ever see this morph out there, can you drop me an email? Tried looking for other places where the Monterey Formation is found up north, if they've had any other trout die-offs which had this particular pathology to it, and so far no hits. Oops. Somehow. Pardon me. The last thing I'll end with people. I can say this in the department here, even during the current administration, people are highly evolved fish. Stand by that. Okay, the one last element you probably noticed way at the beginning, uranium. Turns out the rock, it's not enough that it's got all these other things, it's also got uranium in it. I talked to some friends in the oil industry who say they find the rock by flying at low altitude over areas with basically very good Geiger counters, and so they can detect the uranium and the decay products from the air. The other neat thing about it is Ron Churchill, excuse me, I need to get this on a larger. He's at the time was a state geological survey head who's done a lot of work on radon. And so if you superimpose the Monterey Formation spreads in the Los Angeles Basin, some exposures on Point Dume, that's the indoor radon testing right on top of it. And so this is another thing that was kind of missed. People think of radon risk being something that's back east, the Midwestern states. Some of the highest radon risk in the country is located right here. And it really follows the contours of the formation. At the time they put this together, what about the west? I've now seen the radon results. It follows the contour really nicely. It doesn't follow it in this area. I don't have an explanation for it. It may be that there simply are no tests in that area. There aren't that many homes. I don't know. The real question mark is down in the coastal communities down here. By the way, the radon Monterey Formation link was discovered by a high school science student in Palos Verdes, looking at homes radar risk in Palos Verdes, where there's also Monterey Formation rock. And the state just, it turned out you can predict where it is. So, in just a quick summary here, oblique view of the watershed. Large exposures of the Monterey Formation northern headwaters are enriched in salts, and we're again not table salt. It's got a unique composition. Low summer flows are dominated by these flows, and I want to put this here. I want to put this one little last figure here to show you what I mean. In the wintertime, the flows, just from a volume perspective, are like that. Okay, they're all pretty much equal, and so it's a blend down below. But in the summertime, these smaller ones, they start to dry up, and this up here, this groundwater basin, is at a higher altitude, and there's a large volume of rock. It's basically a giant water tank. So in the late summer, it's fed disproportionately more by the northern watershed, and that explains why you have that oscillation between the two extremes going through. So it's and then finally here on the moving down into the watershed, in retrospect, it's always easy, it's no surprise to find that this kind of rock has this kind of impact down in the water quality. You can't drink it, and in the biota itself. And I'll leave you with one last thought before I move to acknowledgments. Consider fracking, for example. This is a watershed with this rock. It doesn't have much more oil in the watershed, but it's naturally fracked. It's fractured, to within an inch of its life. So if you go into other areas where this rock is found and you artificially fracture it, by any means that you're doing it, and you liberate these elements, and that basin is also used for public water or for any human water supply, you could have an issue there. Exploring that out in the oil industry, a lot of the drilling back east and such are at very deep levels, so no interference with public water. California, I haven't found anybody who's actually looking at that, even with all the controversy about fracking. Okay, and the acknowledgments, a huge volume of work. I don't have time to acknowledge everybody. Some major players, some of whom are here today, from the Los Verdes Municipal Water District and the Joint Powers Authority. If I can get this thing to work. Jan Dugal on data compilation analysis and QA/QC for this volume of data. priceless. Everybody here basically deserves a drink. These are the Brad Glassman, Scott McIndock, and Jackie Gamble in the Water Quality Lab. And when they were working on this, most of them, they had other duties too. They took time away from the duties to work on this side as a side project. The Hill to Bay Stream team, all of them. Without the Hill to Bay Stream team data, I'm not sure if we would have noticed the really poor water quality up in the northern watersheds where no one had sampled before. And then some specific call-outs: Marina Potopoa for the diatoms, Ron Churchill for the radon, Curtis Hopkins for the Coast Geological Society was my entryway into the petroleum geology personnel. So with that, I'd like to thank these people, and that's it. Yeah.
Time for questions?
No questions. Yes, sir.
Did you show on one of the maps the volcanic rock in the watershed?
Yeah. Yeah, it's basically the red in here, Canal volcanics. That's anyway, I'll leave it at that. I'll finish the thought. In the Channel Islands, there's actually a vent out in the Channel Islands. It's tectonically all connected, and on the right conditions, on a cool evening, you can see this vent coming out of the hillside. Thought, wow, volcanic vent. It's not volcanic, it turns out. It's heat, but it's not volcanic heat, and that's just found that out by looking at this research actually. So that was kind of fun. Yes, sir.
The far western part of your watershed area, did you identify what that point is?
Yeah, let me bring up a better map. Just take a moment. Sorry, appreciate the patience. Sorry, folks. I apologize. Yeah. There we go. Okay, and this point here?
Yeah.
Gosh. Well, the county line, I think, runs right around through here. You mean in terms of geography, like a city or something, or? Oh no, I'm sorry, no. What? Yeah. Not shown. Yeah, in fact, not shown is the other side of the mountains here with those drainages. So this is not shoreline here. This is the.
So what is the grade?
That is another geology. I didn't have a. I take that back. This is a topo map. My apologies. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what the gray is. I mean, it's a topographic low. I mean, that's what the map is showing. But I don't know where the location is. There's a water body in here too. So, yeah, this is topography, not geology. Yes.
So have you heard similar results at all from other areas where we got a lot of the organic rich Monterey-related mythologies like Santa Maria, Salinas Basin, Monterey area, Berkeley Hills, west side of the San Joaquin Valley, anything else reporting this kind of stuff?
Yeah, actually, it's people here remember the Kesterson Wildlife Refuge problem, where all the wildlife refuge, all of a sudden all the wildlife started dying. That was a Monterey Formation issue, and that was because during a drought, the only water available was the concentrated water from Monterey Formation, and it was thought, at least for the birds, it was traced to a heavy metal poisoning.
I know on Vandenberg Air Force Base with the remediation they're doing there, they also find some really, really high levels, a lot of these sort of redox sensitive metals and acidity and such like that, which is also where terraces are on the Monterey Formations that's flowing over the groundwater's flowing over the Monterey.
I did, I misspoke earlier when I said I hadn't received any information. I just remember there was two students working up this way, up in Ventura, had found right. If you're familiar with the area, Pacific Coast Highway runs, and the mountains are right there, right between the coast and there. And they, up in one of the headwaters there, they found numbers that actually put these numbers to shame. I mean, in terms of just the amount of salt they had, and they were measuring sulfate levels too. And they're kind of proud because I had said, early, in an early version of the talk, I said you won't find saltier waters in Malibu Creek. And they said, I found one, but it's tiny. It's usually dry most of the year. So in terms of a large stream that's like this, it's pretty unique. Yeah. Okay.
What radon occurred mostly in the Malibu Formation or the Monterey Formation? Does it occur in the ground formation?
Yeah, actually, I'm really glad you mentioned that. I mentioned that I'm mainly talking about the Monterey Formation. This is the Calabasas Formation, and it's also no slouch with respect to salts and other constituents. The radon, actually, answer the question. I'm not going to do this. I'll talk to you. I can show you the map afterwards. But in terms of to answer your question on radon, I need a map that shows the whole coastline. These are exposures of the Monterey Formation purple, small surface exposures, but they go quite deep. And there's areas here you can walk on the beach and see oil seeping out of the rock. So the total organic carbon content is higher down in this area. So there's regional differences within the Monterey Formation itself, and in areas right through the Malibu Civic Center by the Jack in the Box over there, and so on. There's small exposures on the radon. I haven't seen the radon data from the Point Dume area, but I have seen the radon data from this other area that's over by just a little bit north of Pacific Palisades. High radon counts there too. So basically any place you have a surface exposure of this material, you're going to get a high radon count. I'll answer one question which hasn't been asked, but I usually get asked a lot, is what about the Chatsworth facility, all the water quality problems and contamination issues of the Chatsworth. There's the Chatsworth Formation. It's on the other side of the hill. It doesn't have anything to do with the water quality in Malibu Creek. So it's kind of fun in the data to sometimes find a lineup like that between real world data and other real world data. Yes, sir.
Could you point out Simi Valley on that map?
Yeah, let's see. Simi Valley is here. I think I've got that right. Up in this area here. By the way, I had some consulting work with some areas up in the Ojai Valley. The Monterey Formation is found there, but it's found at depth, and so they have to drill through a formation to get to it, and that confuses the Ventura River and some of its tributaries. Should be similar to Malibu Creek, and it's not, for reasons that have to do more with the fact that the formation is deeper. Just the groundwater doesn't get up in the surface water as easily as it does here, where it drains right out of the foothills.
Well, thank you again.
Oh yeah, and if you want the report, again, everything is available here. So, thanks, Don.